two presentations dealing with the event of the crisis, if I can pick up Ben's term, and its consequences. One focusing particularly on the financial stability and the mechanisms for managing European Union finances. The other on the more social implications around, in the English case, nationalism and identity. Questions or comments, please?
I wonder if you would comment on the link between the economic crises that we've had and the reinforcing of national stereotypes, because I noticed the ambassador talked about the Greek ones, and with my experience of living in England and talking to English people, those national stereotypes have been reinforced by the economics crises. When you list the countries that are involved, how important do you think that is in the way they think and the way they react to those sort of polls?
Yeah, the stereotypes. I mean, I don't. This would be sort of anecdotal as well. I mean, I haven't seen any kind of figures, but you know, the stereotypes definitely out there. You know, the so-called olive line. You heard of that one where you know where you can grow olives, everyone starts becoming corrupt and feckless and lazy. There's that, and then but like someone like Dennis Healy, strong believer in that. It's come across very strongly in the German popular press. The Bild has been running a lot of those kind of stories. But this is where it sort of starts, the stereotypes start to trend into xenophobia as well, don't they? And of course the Eastern European migrants are generally seen as poor rather than skilled, whereas actually you might be seeing a brain drain. You know, that might be something that's happening as well. But that dimension, you know, adds, you know, in some senses I may be unfairly characterising somewhere like UKIP as being sort of primarily driven by a desire to leave the EU. That's certainly true, but they might pick up just as many votes from their populist anti-immigration stance. But its main effect is that it's just making the Conservative Party into UKIP. And that's, you know, a lot of Conservative MPs are worried about losing votes, the backbenchers, you know, and there's a lot of pressure there. And the government is responding by giving them a referendum and, you know, saying they'll put curbs on, you know, Eastern European migrants who are seen as poor, and, you know, that's where the stereotypes come in.
A lot of hands.
Ben, having researched the British Empire a century ago, as I have in quite some detail, I'm not surprised really that the English want to withdraw from the European Union in many ways, because that education for decades about the power and the might of the British Empire, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but that education that lasted for decades, I'm sure there still must be a legacy of that.
Yeah, and it comes around again in the sort of the British version of the History Wars. Is the interesting text is something called Our Island Story, which was a textbook. Well, it wasn't even a textbook. Actually, it was a bedtime story, you know, written by an Australian about British history, which the current government now wants to set as a text in the classroom. Right? So you've sort of gone from, you know, you've gone from a kind of a, you know, almost like a semi-fictitious or a nursery tale telling of history back into the classroom. That's interesting because both Cameron and the education minister, called Michael Gove, seriously recommended this book. And you know, there I think has been, as there's a politics of disengagement with Europe, there's been a concomitant re-engagement with places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Singapore, and in a different, slightly more complicated way, the United States. So it's not so much that it's the continuities are there, because the Conservative parties dropped the Commonwealth like, you know, a hot potato when it seemed like Europe was better. But you know, it's come round, you know, again, and so I think you're right to pick up on that. And well, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but you know, the centenary of the Great War comes at an interesting moment where a lot of those commemorations are focused in Britain on Commonwealth participation.
Ben, just picking up on that, how much then of this anti-EU thing is just UK sabre rally, if I can call it that, and is it just another clash of the continent versus the UK, who, you know, getting more control?
Yeah, I think it's more serious than that, right? So if we take, again, Bruno mentioned Margaret Thatcher saying that she wanted her money back in 1984. That was a surprise for a lot of European politicians who were used to sort of doing things the so-called community way. And it was a critique, but it wasn't a critique of the whole edifice. Right? It was quite a detail rather than principle. Right? So a lot of money, but it's still detail rather than principle. Now, it's not so much about kind of whether the UK is awkward. It's about whether it's sort of completely different. Whether the idea of Britain or England, because people still conflate the terms, but it is so different to the EU that politically it can't maintain its position. And I think that's the difference in the last 20 years, is that a growth of Englishness has appeared that is opposed to being European and would claim much more commonality with the English-speaking countries of the world than with European neighbours. And it's a feeling that I think is growing on the right of politics and spreading outwards. That I don't see it on the left at all. It is a problem of the right. So it's not just sabre rattling. I mean, in many ways, Margaret Thatcher, to make that comparison to 30 years ago, I think was in control of her party. I'm not sure Cameron is.
I suspect that for the English, they believe they know Scotland. Scotland is, as long as they make money, they are happy. We don't need to worry about it. We understand how they think and work. When they look at the continent, it's all just an enormous fog. They haven't sufficiently distinguished between how to play with the Dutch, the Danes, the Germans, the Swedes, and the Austrians, and so on. They haven't maintained knowledge base for that. 200 years ago, they had the knowledge base because of Hanover. And the English king always supported the emperor, for example, against the Prussians for the French Revolution. At that time, England was part of the continent, but after the Napoleonic Wars, it went international, and the knowledge about how to play with the idiosyncrasies of the different European nations was left.
I think actually one of the things about current, I'm going to call it English Euroscepticism, because that's what I think it is that actually they feel that they do know how to deal with different countries, like the Dutch or the Germans, less so the French, maybe the Scandinavians. But the whole, it's the EU structures that have created the fog. I mean, I've heard sort of quite prominent Eurosceptics say that say, Anglo-German relations would be much better if Britain was not in the EU. They sort of see this as a way of disassociating political relations from the institutional constraints that they believe the EU creates. And I think that, there's a strong liberal tradition in German politics. There's a sort of free trade type liberalism. The same with the Dutch and so on and so forth. That those people, because they're all kind of global neoliberal free traders as well, Eurosceptics by and large. They're not on the left of politics really anymore. Well, I'll qualify that in a minute, but they sort of see that as getting rid of the EU as a way of creating more harmonious relations.
They haven't learned how to play federal structure.
Oh no, that's totally antithetical to their mindset.
Exactly, but the dominant powers in Europe, the French, not the French, the Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, regional politics plays a role. Regional politics is given impression in the national power, so you know how to play the region.
Yeah, that's not. It's too young in Britain. Yeah.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that the Euroscepticism might be looking into a broader anti-internationalist kind of thing, like the anti-internationalist kind of resurgence, I guess, in the US? Even John Howard here, sort of anti-internationalism.
One of the sort of the targets of populist politics is so-called cosmopolitan elites, and of course, Europeans fit that bill. perfectly. And I think, I say this as a former Erasmus student myself, is that whilst that was wonderful to learn other languages and go to different countries and so on, what it does is create a more European-minded tertiary sector, and it leaves behind non-tertiary educated people. I take on board the thing about Erasmus Plus, that it encompasses more than that. But I think that's what's happening. So you get sort of winners and losers from both globalisation and European integration, which are not necessarily the same thing, although there's sometimes an overlap. But the winners tend to be seen as the kind of professionally educated middle classes, and the losers are the ones who are not mobile, who don't have that education, and that a lot of populist parties play into that. And populist parties, I mean, I've talked about, on the Conservative Party in Britain being threatened by a populist party on the right. Another source of populist support are just centre-left voters who no longer believe in their centre-left party. And so some of the kind of voters for the far right have come, in Britain's case, from the Labour Party. So, so I think that's important. I mean, there's sort of, on one hand, there's a resentment against migrants coming in, but there's also against the sense of a sort of a mobile professional class that populists can then react against. Although sometimes, in the sort of Nigel Farage or York Hyder or people like that, they're kind of from that class as well. So I'm not a psychologist, but there must be all sorts of self-loathing going on there, but I don't know. But I think that it's all part of it. One of the reasons I think there is a kind of a wider malaise of politics that I referred to earlier, and why we get low turnouts decreasing turnouts in, say, European or other elections, is just that after 30 years of being told that government should be small, people sort of start to believe that, and they don't expect, they think, well, what's the point? Why do I have this engagement? And I think that it's actually had a kind of an effect that sort of corroded civic trust in a way, and so, no one's really sure who's in charge anymore. I mean, that's kind of one of the difficulties as well. So it's all mixed up in there, and I think that the various Eurosceptic expressions, they all have their own sort of peculiarities, but there's commonalities too.
Others?
Yes. Can I just ask Peter to clarify? Do you think that the crisis is over in Europe? You've outlined what the policy changes and but I think we had the Spanish Prime Minister saying, well, the recession is over, but the crisis continues. What sort of economic future do you see in the near term?
I think it's pretty bleak, actually. But it's interesting though, because if you look historically, Greece, for example, has had this long history of economic problems that go well beyond before the Second World War. And since then it's had a whole lot of political, it's got a strong history of fascist dictatorships and civil war. So is Italy and so is Spain. So, you could argue that there's these sort of entrenched problems in some parts of Europe that are ongoing and have been ongoing for actually some period of time. But just on the pure economic level, I just can't see how you can get out of that sort of level of debt that some of those countries are in at the same time with the unemployment that they've got. It's just, if you take Greece, anybody who's been to Greece would know it's a desert pretty much. The major industries that Greece has is shipping, which is all internationalised. Like they've got all the head offices that are not in Athens anymore. They're all just on the stock exchange of the world. And unfortunately, there's been this huge capital drain as well from places like Greece, where all the wealthy Greeks have moved their money to Swiss bank accounts. So they're not reinvesting back in society. There's no major industries. The prospects of the ambassador was saying that tourism is, the forecast is that tourism is hopefully one of those industries that's going to help Greece tourism. It's not a huge industry. And Greece has got to compete with Spain, the Amalfi Coast and Italy and all these other places. So I just can't see that it's very promising.
Yes.
If UKIP sort of wins or does the best in the EU elections, what does that actually mean? What does that change?
Oh, well, in one sense, not much, because their relative position overall in the European Parliament will be particularly weak. It's more significant for British politics, because it will actually be seen as a kind of a successful breakthrough in a way, not at the British parliamentary elections, but just that there's an outside party that's neither Labour nor Conservative, or indeed the Liberal Democrats, the sort of the third party, and it will just accelerate, I think, and it'll accelerate the desire for a referendum on independence, and it will scare Conservative backbenchers to give in more and more to demands for withdrawal. Whether they can translate that and sustain that success, in a general election where they don't have any seats in the British Parliament at all, or B, actually at a referendum if it comes to it, will remain to be seen. But it'll be a pretty big shock for the British political system, which for a long time has been based on two-party politics.
And do you think that opening up the doors to the Romanians and the Bulgarians on the 1st of January, do you think how those groups are perceived and portrayed in the British media will have, in the next couple of months, will have much of an impact on the way people either whether they vote and how they vote in the EU elections?
Yeah, well, the point about whether they vote is a good one, because people typically don't. So what you get is the kind of very disgruntled and motivated people at either ends of the spectrum. So an increased turnout is probably only likely to benefit UKIP. Whether that will then link to perceptions of migrants, going on previous depictions of migrants, I mean, the polls were sort of seen, because they're less visible, were sort of seen somehow as less problematic than, say, waves of migration from East Africa, the West Indies, the subcontinent. On the other hand, UKIP have done a very successful job of claiming that the United Kingdom's borders are not secure, and part of that problem is the EU. So, yeah, I mean, look, it's always possible that there may be a sort of a kind of xenophobic element to that, but I suspect people who are going to vote probably you would know now if they were going to vote. So the polls in that regard are probably quite accurate.
Just following up on that, if you could do much better in terms of seats in the European Parliament, presumably, I think you said earlier that they're there essentially as anti-EU.
Yeah.
So are they getting to the numbers where they might be able to disrupt the integration process because of their influence, or are they really still just marginal in the Parliament?
They're very marginal. What they can use it for is a platform. That's the thing. And so they can do sort of political stunts like, put on green T-shirts that complain about one particular policy or another. And that, of course, doesn't get picked up, but it plays out very well with their supporters. So through social media, you don't need to broadcast stuff anymore. You can narrowcast it to the people that just reinforces their opinions. The kind of spoiling they do is they occasionally they'll get put on a committee, and then they just kind of like what's the word? They filibuster's not the right word. They just spoil. Yeah, they just spoil it. So with their kind of sexist attitudes as much as anything. So in a very minor way, but its import will be about British politics, and that will be quite significant.
Any others? It's been a long day, I think, to get the summer school going, and we've covered quite a bit of ground to do both with the nature of the European Union as it is at present, as well as the immediate challenges that are faced. Can I finish this session by thanking Peter and Ben very much for your contribution?